You want to know what a $320 million maritime defense system sounds like when it dies. It does not scream. It does not explode. It just goes quiet. Complete digital silence. At 11:45 on a Tuesday morning in March, I was sitting in my truck 8 blocks from Pacific Defense Systems, watching my laptop screen as Harbor Shield locked itself down in front of a room full of Department of Homeland Security officials. The screens went black. The countdown hit 0. And the career of the man who fired me collapsed in real time. My name is Tom Garrett. I am 49 years old. Before corporate cybersecurity, I spent 18 years in Navy intelligence, and for 9 years, Harbor Shield was not just my job. It was my life's work. But before I tell you how Charles Patterson lost everything before lunch, I need to tell you what happened 3 hours earlier. Because the story does not start with the shutdown. It starts with a breakfast I almost did not finish. My daughter Sarah and I have a standing Tuesday morning routine. Same diner in Coronado, same corner table, same view of the street through a window that fogs up on cool mornings. She was 17 then, a senior at Coronado High, the kind of kid who cuts her pancakes into perfect little squares and thinks about every question before she asks it. That morning, she looked up from her plate and said, "Dad, what does integrity under pressure actually look like in real life?" I turned my coffee cup in my hands for a second. Outside, a Navy helicopter crossed the bay. Somewhere across that water, the ports I had spent 9 years protecting were already moving their first containers of the day. Integrity under pressure, I told her, is what you do when the right choice costs you something real. She was quiet for a moment. Like your job? I almost laughed. Sometimes your job. Sometimes your reputation. Sometimes people you thought were on your side. The point is, if you only do the right thing when it is easy, that is not integrity. That is just convenience. Sarah looked at me with the kind of steady calm that used to belong to her mother. "Okay," she said softly. "I think I understand." I squeezed her hand and told her she would do fine at her Naval Academy interview, because she would mean every word she said. At the time, I thought I was just being a father over pancakes. 2 hours later, I found out I had been rehearsing. After I dropped Sarah at school, I stopped for coffee on Orange Avenue, sat in traffic on the I-5 for 20 minutes, and walked into Pacific Defense Systems expecting a routine briefing about the DHS contract expansion. The demo was scheduled for 11. The conference room was already being prepared. Everything felt like a normal Tuesday. Until I saw Charles Patterson pacing behind his glass desk, like a man trying to outrun a disaster only he could see. Charles had been CEO for 3 years, brought in from some Wall Street advisory firm to, quote, modernize operations. What that actually meant was cutting costs, compressing timelines, squeezing departments, and pretending that national security infrastructure could be managed like a quarterly earnings report. Pacific stock had flatlined around $47 a share for 2 years, while competitors climbed steadily. The board was restless. Charles was desperate. And desperate executives are dangerous because they start mistaking motion for strategy. "Tom, sit down," he said. "No coffee, no small talk about the Padres, no fake laugh about the I-5. Just that smooth corporate voice people use right before they ruin your morning and call it an operational realignment. We need to talk about fresh perspective," he said. Before I could ask what that meant, the door behind me opened. And in walked Austin Patterson, 25 years old. Charles's nephew, 280,000 YouTube subscribers, fixed tripos, and the confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone whose opinion mattered. He wore ripped jeans, designer sneakers, and a jacket that probably cost more than my first car. In one hand, an iced coffee. In the other, his phone was already recording. Uncle Chuck says you're going to walk me through the whole system, Austin said, grinning like he had just been handed backstage passes. I'm thinking a behind-the-scenes series. Real defense tech, live demos, maybe some day-in-the-life stuff. My followers would absolutely eat this up. I looked at Charles. I waited for the punchline. There was no punchline. You want me to train him, I said slowly, on Harbor Shield. Charles folded his hands on the desk with the composure of a man presenting a vision instead of a catastrophe. Austin brings digital reach and modern perspective, he said. The board believes we need new voices if we're going to compete for the next generation of defense contracts. I looked at Austin again. His phone was still running, pointed at the room. At the window behind Charles, the port of San Diego stretched across the horizon. Container ships moved slowly through the channel. Vessel traffic systems, cargo cranes, fuel distribution lines, customs networks. Every layer of infrastructure that Harbor Shield monitored around the clock, 7 days a week, because someone had to. That was the difference between Charles and me. He saw a stock price. I saw a target. Harbor Shield was not a product demo. It was not a brand. It was not something you turned into content for people watching on their phones during lunch. It was 15 layers of military-grade architecture protecting the backbone of West Coast maritime infrastructure. One bad access decision could expose cargo management systems handling roughly $1.4 billion in trade every single day. One careless camera angle could put a visible username, an interface layout, or a workflow pattern in front of anyone watching a YouTube video who happened to know what they were looking at. Enemies do not always need the whole blueprint. Sometimes all they need is one reflection in a monitor. But Charles was nodding along like Austin had just outlined the future of national security. And Austin was already talking about quick tips, deep dives on real cyber attacks, maybe even live reactions to how hackers try to break into port systems. Every word out of his mouth made my stomach tighten. I can't do that, Charles, I said. The room went still. Austin's phone dropped half an inch, like even he sensed the air had changed. Can't, Charles said carefully, or won't. And there it was, Sarah's question, arriving right on time. What does integrity under pressure actually look like? It looks like this, I thought. Standing in a glass office on the morning of the biggest contract demonstration in company history, watching your career lean over a ledge, and choosing which direction you want to fall. Won't, I said. Charles's jaw tightened. I kept my voice even. Harbor Shield protects critical maritime infrastructure, port operations, cargo networks, vessel traffic management, fuel distribution systems, DHS-linked monitoring protocols across the entire West Coast. It is not a training environment for a social media consultant who thinks port cybersecurity is content. Austin gave a short laugh, but it sounded smaller than it started. Charles leaned forward. You are refusing a direct instruction from the CEO of this company? I am refusing to create a security exposure that could compromise the West Coast port network 3 hours before a federal evaluation. For a moment, the polish fell away completely. What replaced it was not strategy. It was a man with a board to impress, a contract to win, and not enough patience to tolerate the one person in the room willing to tell him what he did not want to hear. Charles reached for the phone on his desk. Slowly, deliberately, like a man performing authority for an audience. Send security up here. Austin's phone came back up immediately. Thomas Garrett, Charles said, drawing out each syllable, your refusal to adapt to Pacific Defense Systems' evolving business model demonstrates a fundamental misalignment with our organizational direction. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated. 9 years, reduced to a line from an HR handbook. 2 guards arrived inside 2 minutes. I had 15 minutes to gather my personal belongings. No access to company systems, no conversation with my team, no goodbye to the engineers who had built Harbor Shield with me. As they walked me down the hallway, I passed rows of cubicles where people stared at their screens without looking up. Some looked scared. Most just looked away. Then I caught Maria Rodriguez's eye, my lead developer. She mouthed, "What happened?" I gave her the smallest signal I could manage without the guards noticing. Watch and wait, because Charles had just fired me. But he had made a mistake that no executive override, no legal maneuver, and no public relations campaign could undo. He had forgotten to ask who actually owned the thing he was trying to keep. Let me take you back 6 years, because that is where this story really begins. When my ex-wife, Jennifer, was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, everything I thought I understood about institutional loyalty stopped making sense. Pacific's insurance approved the standard treatments and denied the rest. Navy retirement benefits covered what they covered and nothing more. Specialists wanted authorizations that took weeks. Experimental protocols needed waivers that nobody wanted to sign. I watched Jennifer fight for her life while I fought people in office buildings over every bill, every denial, every delay. Sarah was 11 years old enough to understand fear, too young to understand why adults kept whispering in hallways when they thought she was not listening. Jennifer survived, but that year left a mark I never lost. It taught me that loyalty to an institution means absolutely nothing if the institution sees you as a replaceable part. Companies do not remember your late nights. They do not remember your canceled vacations. They do not remember the years you chose the system over everything else. They remember the quarter when costs went up. So I made a decision. Quietly, carefully, and with the help of my attorney Patrick Wells, I created Garrett Maritime Technologies LLC. My father, Robert Garrett, a retired Navy Chief Petty Officer, was listed as the primary stakeholder. Every core patent that made Harbor Shield work, every critical architecture layer, every security mechanism that separated it from every other maritime monitoring platform on the market. All of it was filed through that LLC before I ever delivered the finished system to Pacific. Pacific had licenses, they had contracts, they had usage rights. But ownership was a different conversation entirely. And buried inside those licensing agreements was a single condition that Charles had never bothered to read carefully enough. Pacific Defense Systems could operate Harbor Shield only under one of 2 circumstances. Either the original system architect remained in place, or a verified, legally supervised transfer of system control was completed through Garrett Maritime Technologies. Charles had done neither. He had fired the architect, blocked all access, and handed classified adjacent infrastructure to his nephew 90 minutes before a federal evaluation. That was why Level 15 existed. If the chain of control was ever compromised without proper authorization, Harbor Shield would enter protective lockdown. No administrative access, no demo mode, no executive override, no emergency bypass, no workaround. Most of Pacific's team knew about the standard security layers, authentication protocols, encryption architecture, redundancy systems, disaster recovery, the public-facing protections any enterprise system would have. They had no idea Level 15 existed. The keys were not in Charles's office, or Pacific's server room, or the board's legal files. They were on a small black USB drive that had been sitting in my jacket pocket since I walked out of that building. The guards walked me to the parking garage. Rodriguez, the older one, had been a Marine Staff Sergeant in Fallujah. Thompson, the younger one, had served Navy supply lines in the Pacific. Both of them knew what bad orders smelled like. In the elevator, I kept my voice just below the range of the security camera microphone. They are handing Harbor Shield to the wrong people, I said. Demo is at 11. DHS is going to be in that room, and the replacement team has never been inside the core architecture. Rodriguez stared straight ahead. Thompson looked at me through the reflection in the elevator doors. Anything we can do? Thompson asked quietly. Give me my full 15 minutes, I said, and take your time getting to the garage. They did. I packed everything I needed in 8 minutes, spent the rest of the time sitting at my desk one last time. Photos of Sarah. The old Navy picture from the USS Nimitz. The coffee mug she gave me for Father's Day. The one that said, "World's Okayest Dad," in chipped blue letters. Austin appeared in the doorway with his phone still running. Uncle Chuck said not to let you take company property, he said, sounding like a child assigned hall monitor duty. I looked at him for a moment. Everything I need, I told him quietly, is already mine. He had no way to know what that meant. When I reached my truck in the parking garage, I sat for a moment without moving. I thought I might feel rage, or grief, or the particular hollow feeling that comes with losing something you built with your own hands. Instead, I felt the cold, precise focus that used to settle in during Navy intelligence briefings, when the threat picture finally resolved and the next move became obvious. I opened my laptop. No company network, no Pacific credentials. Just my personal phone hotspot, my private authentication pathway, and the administrative channel I had built into Harbor Shield from day one. The channel that Charles did not know existed because he had never asked the right questions. The screen came alive with a single message. Welcome, System Architect. All systems operational. Security level 15 armed and ready. I sat with those words for a moment. Then I inserted the USB drive into my laptop. The confirmation window opened. Activate level 15 protective protocol? I thought about Admiral Patricia Hayes, who would be sitting in that conference room in 2 hours and 11 minutes. 30 years in maritime defense. The kind of officer who could tell the difference between a software glitch and a governance failure before the error message finished loading. If anyone in that room would understand what Harbor Shield was actually doing, it would be her. I thought about the engineers who had spent years in the trenches with me building something that actually mattered. I thought about Sarah asking me what integrity under pressure looked like. Then I pressed enter. The countdown began. 2 hours, 11 minutes, 0 seconds. And Charles Patterson had no idea his company was already going under. At 11 o'clock sharp, Charles walked into Pacific's main conference room like a man walking toward a coronation. 3 massive screens covered the front wall. Engineers stood at support stations. The polished conference table was lined with Department of Homeland Security officials, Coast Guard representatives, and Admiral Patricia Hayes sitting precisely in the center with a closed folder in front of her and the kind of stillness that comes from 30 years of evaluating things that matter. Charles loved rooms like that. Important people, serious money. An audience waiting to believe he was the architect of something great. He had rehearsed this presentation. He had the slide deck memorized. He had the handshakes planned. Austin sat near the front, whispering to his phone. Big day at Pacific. Defense tech is about to get disrupted. Charles ignored it. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, smooth and polished as ever. What you are about to see today is not simply maritime security software. This is the future of American port protection. A replacement engineer began the demonstration sequence. For 17 seconds, everything looked exactly right. The interface loaded. The regional maps appeared. The vessel traffic overlay came online. The port of Long Beach, the port of Los Angeles, San Diego Bay. Cargo systems activating on screen one after another, just the way Charles had rehearsed it. The room leaned forward. Then the first message appeared in the center of the display. System architect authentication required. The engineer frowned and typed faster. Access denied. Employment verification failed. Charles's smile held for about 2 seconds longer than the situation deserved. "What is that?" he asked. The engineer swallowed. "The system is requesting architect-level credentials, sir. I don't have the clearance to bypass it." "Then use the override." I tried. There is no override at this level. 8 blocks away, sitting in my truck with a cold cup of coffee and my laptop open on the passenger seat, I watched the countdown hit 0. The screens in that conference room flashed red 3 times. Then everything stopped. No maps, no vessel overlays, no cargo systems, no polished interface for Charles to sell. Just a black screen and one message in clean white letters. Security lockdown initiated. Harbor shield system in protective mode. All access revoked. Contact system administrator for resolution. The room went silent. Not the quiet of polite attention. The silence of powerful people realizing that what they came to evaluate has just become something else entirely. Charles turned to the engineer. "Fix it." The young man typed with hands that were almost shaking. "I can't access the core system, sir. There is a protocol layer I've never seen before." "What protocol?" "It's called Security Level 15, he paused. "I don't know what that is." Charles stood very still for a moment. Then his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. My name. He stepped back from the table and answered. "Tom." His voice had dropped all the polish. What remained underneath was cold and flat. "Whatever you did, reverse it. Right now." I looked at the black screen on my laptop. Harbor Shield was running exactly as designed, doing exactly what it was built to do, protecting itself from the people who were not qualified to control it. "I didn't do anything to Harbor Shield," I said. "I let it do what it was built to do." "You work for me." "No, Charles, you fired me this morning, remember?" Silence. "So now you need to talk to the owner." I heard the exact moment he understood. Not the sharp intake of breath, not the words, just the particular quality of the silence that follows when someone realizes the power they thought they had was borrowed all along. Behind him in the conference room, Admiral Patricia Hayes leaned forward. She did not raise her voice. She never needed to. "Mr. Patterson," she said clearly, "are you telling this evaluation that your primary maritime defense platform is inaccessible during a Department of Homeland Security demonstration?" Charles opened his mouth. Nothing useful came out. Admiral Hayes looked at the black screens, then at Austin's phone still pointed at the room, then at the engineers standing at empty stations with nothing to show. "Your core infrastructure is locked down," she said. "Your replacement team cannot identify the security protocol holding it. Your marketing consultant is recording a sensitive federal evaluation for social media. And the only person your staff believes can resolve this situation is the man you terminated less than 3 hours ago." One moment of silence. Then she gathered her folder and stood. The DHS officials followed her in the clean, disciplined way of people who have just seen everything they needed to see. Charles moved toward her. "Admiral, please give us 10 minutes. She paused at the door. "You do not need 10 minutes, Mr. Patterson. You need governance structure, legal clarity over your technology assets, and adults in charge of critical national security infrastructure." Then she walked out. And just like that, $320 million in federal contract funding walked out of the building behind her. For a few seconds after she left, the room held its silence. Then the panic started. Charles barked instructions at engineers who had nothing to fix. Someone from legal whispered into a phone with the careful tone of a person establishing plausible deniability. Someone from public relations stood near the wall, looking like she had just realized her entire week was about to become a crisis communication exercise. Austin, meanwhile, had accidentally live-streamed enough of the collapse for the internet to do the rest. Not the classified content, not the system architecture, just Charles sweating under conference room lights, the Black Harbor Shield screens, Admiral Hayes delivering her verdict, and Austin's own running commentary as the company came apart behind him. Within an hour, the clips were circulating. By noon, a hashtag was forming. By 2 o'clock, journalists were calling Pacific's PR line. By 3, board members were quietly distancing themselves from any decision involving Austin Patterson. And through all of it, the same message stayed locked on every screen inside Pacific Defense Systems. Harbor Shield System in protective mode. All access revoked. For licensing inquiries, contact Garrett Maritime Technologies, LLC. Authorized representative, Robert Garrett. That was when Charles finally understood what I had told him on the phone. This was not a password problem. It was not a technical glitch. It was not something an IT department could reset or a lawyer could reframe. The company he thought he controlled had been built on technology he never truly owned, and the man he had fired that morning held every key. While Pacific was in freefall, I was sitting across from Patrick Wells in his downtown law office, watching him spread a thick folder across the conference table with the calm of a man who had been waiting for this meeting for 6 years. Patent filings, licensing agreements, employment conditions, technology transfer clauses, ownership documentation for every core component of Harbor Shield. Every page had been prepared, notarized, and filed for a day I had always hoped would never come. Pacific held usage rights under a conditional licensing structure, Patrick said, tapping the first page. Those rights were contingent on continuity of the original system architect. By terminating you without initiating the transfer protocol, they breached the agreement. I looked out his window toward the harbor. Somewhere across the city, Charles was probably still trying to find a story that made this sound like a vendor dispute. What happens to the contracts? I asked. That depends on what Admiral Hayes decides to do next. And before Patrick could finish the thought, his assistant opened the door. Admiral Hayes is on line 1. Patrick and I looked at each other. He put the call on speaker. Mr. Garrett, Admiral Hayes said. Her voice was the same as it had been in that conference room. Precise, unhurried, already 3 steps ahead. I have had a very interesting morning. So have I, Admiral. I am less interested in the situation at Pacific Defense Systems than I am in Harbor Shield itself. Our team has questions about the actual ownership structure of the technology protecting our ports. Your attorney is welcome to join the conversation. Patrick was already pulling his chair forward. For the first time since 8:15 that morning, I let myself take a full breath. Charles thought firing me ended the chapter. Admiral Hayes had just opened the next one. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, I was sitting in a secure conference room overlooking San Diego Bay with Admiral Hayes, 2 members of her team, and Pacific's general counsel, who had the expression of a man slowly realizing he was in the wrong room. Admiral Hayes had the Harbor Shield ownership documentation in front of her. She had Pacific's failed demonstration report beside it. She had the kind of focused stillness that comes from spending 30 years deciding which systems were worth trusting with the country's coastline. Mr. Garrett, she said, Pacific Defense Systems disappointed this evaluation today. I shook my head. Charles Patterson disappointed you. Pacific was just the building he used to do it from. She held my gaze for a moment. That is close to our conclusion, she said. DHS counsel reviewed the licensing structure line by line. The patents were clean, the ownership chain was clean. The conditional breach was documented and timestamped from the moment my badge was deactivated that morning. And Austin Patterson, in his considerable wisdom, had live-streamed enough of the disaster that half of it was already public record. 2 hours later, the framework was in place. Garrett Maritime Defense would be incorporated immediately. The Harbor Shield patents would transfer formally from my father's LLC under federal oversight and proper legal supervision. DHS was prepared to provide $400 million in development funding and a long-term contract structure built around the system and the people who actually understood it. Charles fired me at 8:15 in the morning. By sunset, I controlled the technology his company had been built on. By the following morning, Pacific's board had suspended Charles pending investigation. Their stock dropped before the market opened. Reporters were outside the building. Austin had deleted the stream, but the internet had already saved everything worth saving, and Harbor Shield was no longer a Pacific product. It was mine. That evening, I picked Sarah up from soccer practice. She climbed into the truck, still wearing her cleats, grass on her socks, sweaty and tired, and already looking at me the way she always does when she knows something happened and is waiting for me to tell her about it. "Dad," she said, dropping her bag, "your company is all over the internet." I took her to our pizza place in Coronado. Same corner booth, same window. 2 slices of pepperoni and 1 soda she barely touched because she was too busy listening. I told her everything. Charles, Austin, the shutdown, the DHS room, Admiral Hayes, the new company, all of it. When I finished, Sarah was quiet for a long time, not thinking about what to say, just sitting with it the way she always does when something matters enough to earn real silence. Then she looked at me. "Dad, that is exactly what integrity under pressure looks like." I laughed softly. "You think so?" "You knew the right choice might cost you everything," she said, "and you did it anyway. But you were also prepared. You did not just do the right thing and hope for the best. You were ready." She paused. "That is the part most people miss." Then she raised her soda cup across the table. "To the world's okayest dad," she said, smiling, "who turned out to be pretty okay." I raised my water glass and tapped it against hers. And for the first time all day, the day that started with a firing and ended with a federal contract, I felt exactly like what I was. A man who had built something real, protected it carefully, and stood on it when it mattered most. Charles Patterson was good at many things: presentations, boardrooms, confident language in uncomfortable situations. But there is one thing men like Charles never quite understand about people like me. Real power is not the title on your door. It is not the stock price. It is not the room full of people who are too cautious to disagree with you out loud. Real power is knowing the truth, standing on it without flinching, and letting the consequences arrive exactly when they are supposed to. If this story stayed with you, I want to hear from you in the comments. Would you have stayed quiet and prepared the way I did? Or would you have confronted them right there in that office? And if you believe that the people who build the things that matter deserve to own them, subscribe to Alex's Revenge Justice, because the next story is about someone who waited 10 years for karma to show up, and when it finally did, it arrived with documents.